The morning sun cast long shadows across the Henderson driveway in Sacramento as Robert finished loading the last of their camping gear into the back of their 1962 Chevrolet station wagon. The wood-paneled vehicle was packed to capacity with sleeping bags, a canvas tent, Coleman lanterns, and enough canned food to feed an army. Patricia emerged from the house carrying a wicker picnic basket, her blonde hair neatly styled despite the early hour. "Danny, Susan, come on now, your father wants to get on the road before the traffic gets heavy," she called toward the house, adjusting her blue sundress and checking her watch. 12-year-old Danny burst through the screen door, his crew cut still damp from his morning shower, clutching his prized Kodak Brownie camera. Behind him, 8-year-old Susan skipped along, her pigtails bouncing as she carried her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Buttons. "Dad, can I take pictures of the bears?" Danny asked excitedly, holding up his camera. Robert chuckled, wiping his hands on a rag. At 35, he was a sturdy man with kind eyes and calloused hands from his work at the lumber yard. "Well, son, we'll have to see what wildlife we encounter. But remember, we keep our distance from any bears we might spot." "Oh, Robert, don't scare them," Patricia said, though her smile betrayed her own excitement. This would be their first family camping trip to Yosemite, something they'd been planning and saving for all year. The drive through California's Central Valley was long and dusty. The air conditioning in their Chevrolet struggled against the July heat, and they stopped frequently for cold sodas and to stretch their legs. Danny spent most of the journey with his nose pressed against the window, watching the landscape transform from flat farmland to rolling hills, and finally to the towering granite cliffs and waterfalls of Yosemite Valley. "Look at that," Susan gasped as they drove through the valley, pointing at the massive rock formation looming ahead. "It's like a giant's castle." "That's El Capitan, sweetheart," Robert explained, slowing the car so they could all admire the monolithic granite face. "It's over 3,000 feet tall." Patricia reached for Robert's free hand. "It's even more beautiful than the postcards," she whispered. The family campground was bustling with activity when they arrived in the late afternoon. Dozens of tents and travel trailers were scattered among the towering pine trees, and the air was filled with the sounds of children playing, adults chatting, and the distant crackling of campfires. The scent of pine needles and wood smoke created an intoxicating atmosphere of wilderness adventure. Robert pulled into their assigned campsite, number 47, and shut off the engine. The sudden silence was replaced by the natural sounds of the forest, birds chirping, wind rustling through the trees, and somewhere in the distance the thundering of Yosemite Falls. "All right, Team Henderson," Robert announced, stepping out and stretching his back. "Let's get this camp set up before dark." The next hour was a flurry of organized chaos. Robert and Danny worked together to erect their large canvas tent, while Patricia organized their supplies, and Susan collected pine cones for kindling. Their campsite gradually took shape. The tent positioned to catch the morning sun but remained shaded during the hot afternoon hours, a designated cooking area with their camp stove and picnic table, and a neat stack of firewood Robert had purchased from the camp store. As evening approached and they sat around their first campfire, roasting hot dogs on long forks, Danny suddenly pointed toward the campsite across the narrow dirt road. "Hey, Dad, look at that camper. I've never seen one like that before." Robert followed his son's gaze and felt his eyebrows raise in surprise. Parked at the site directly across from them was indeed an unusual recreational vehicle. Unlike the boxy utilitarian travel trailers common in 1964, this motorhome had sleek, aerodynamic lines that seemed almost futuristic. Its silver exterior gleamed in the firelight, and large panoramic windows wrapped around the front and sides in a way that looked decades ahead of current design trends. "That's quite something," Patricia murmured, adjusting Susan on her lap. "It looks like something from a science fiction movie." A family of 4 emerged from the remarkable vehicle: a tall, distinguished man with graying temples, an elegant woman with perfectly coiffed dark hair, a teenage boy, and a girl about Susan's age. They moved with an odd, synchronized grace as they began setting up outdoor chairs around a portable table. "Should we go introduce ourselves?" Patricia asked. "They look like nice people." Robert nodded, standing and brushing off his khaki pants. "That's the neighborly thing to do. Come on, kids." As the Henderson family approached their new neighbors, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that something about the scene felt strangely timeless, as if he were looking at a photograph that had somehow come to life. The feeling was so strong that he unconsciously patted the pocket where he kept his own camera, a reliable Leica that had been his pride and joy since his army days. Little did Robert know that within days, He would take a photograph that would haunt him for the rest of his life and change everything he thought he knew about reality itself. The family across the campsite looked up with warm smiles as the Hendersons approached. The man was the first to stand, extending a well-manicured hand toward Robert. He appeared to be in his early 40s, with an air of quiet sophistication that seemed out of place in the rustic campground setting. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Robert couldn't quite place. "I'm Thomas Marlowe, and this is my wife Eleanor, my son Michael, and my daughter Caroline." Eleanor Marlowe rose gracefully from her chair, her dark hair styled in a perfect bouffant that somehow remained unaffected by the outdoor conditions. She wore a cream-colored blouse and pressed slacks that looked fresh, despite a full day of travel. "How wonderful to meet you. Are you folks from California?" "Sacramento," Patricia replied, unconsciously smoothing her own hair, which had become somewhat disheveled during the tent setup. "I'm Patricia Henderson, and this is my husband Robert. These are our children, Danny and Susan." Young Caroline Marlowe stepped forward with a bright smile. "Susan's such a pretty name. Would you like to see my doll collection? I brought them all the way from home." Susan's eyes lit up, clutching Mr. Buttons tighter. "Yes, please." Michael, who appeared to be about 16, nodded politely at Danny. "That's a nice camera you've got there. Are you planning to photograph the wildlife?" Danny beamed with pride. "I want to get pictures of everything. Bears, deer, maybe even a mountain lion if we're lucky." Thomas chuckled. "A young photographer. How admirable. Photography captures moments that might otherwise be lost to time, don't you think?" Something in the way Thomas said those words made Robert feel slightly uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. "It certainly does. What brings your family to Yosemite?" "Oh, we make this trip every few years," Eleanor said, settling back into her chair with fluid grace. "There's something about this place that calls to us, the timeless quality of these ancient rocks and trees. Some places exist outside the normal flow of time, wouldn't you agree?" Patricia laughed nervously. "Well, I suppose it does feel like stepping back into a simpler era out here." As the adults continued talking, Danny found himself drawn to the Marlowe's extraordinary motorhome. The vehicle seemed to shimmer slightly in the firelight, its sleek surfaces reflecting the flames in ways that defied the laws of physics he'd learned in school. The windows were larger and more curved than any RV he'd ever seen, and the chrome fixtures had an almost liquid quality. "Impressive, isn't it?" Thomas had noticed Danny's fascination. "Would you like a tour?" "Could I really?" Danny asked, his voice filled with wonder. "Of course. Eleanor, why don't you show Patricia and Susan the interior while the men examine the technical aspects?" The inside of the motorhome was even more remarkable than its exterior. The furnishings were elegant and modern in a way that seemed decades ahead of 1964 styling. The upholstery was a deep burgundy material that felt unlike anything Patricia had ever touched, and the lighting came from fixtures that produced a soft, even glow without any visible bulbs. "This is incredible," Patricia breathed, running her fingers along the smooth countertop in the compact kitchen area. "What company manufactured this? My brother works for Airstream and I've never seen anything like it." Eleanor's smile flickered for just a moment. "Oh, it's a custom job. Thomas has very particular tastes when it comes to travel accommodations." Meanwhile, outside, Robert and Thomas were discussing the vehicle's technical specifications. Robert, who considered himself knowledgeable about automobiles, found himself increasingly puzzled by what Thomas was telling him. "The engine is remarkably efficient," Thomas explained, lifting the hood to reveal a power plant unlike anything Robert had ever seen. The components seemed to gleam with an inner light, and several parts appeared to be made from materials he couldn't identify. "We can travel for days without stopping for fuel." "What kind of engine is this?" Robert asked, leaning closer. "I've been working with motors since I was Danny's age, but I've never seen anything like it." "Advanced engineering," Thomas replied vaguely. "Sometimes the best innovations come from unexpected sources." As the evening progressed, both families settled around the Marlowe's campfire, which burned with flames that seemed unusually bright and cast shadows that flickered in patterns that didn't quite match the movement of the fire. The children played together while the adults shared stories, though Robert noticed that whenever he asked specific questions about where the Marlowes lived or what Thomas did for work, the answers were always polite but somehow evasive. "We should get a photograph," Eleanor suggested as the evening wound down, "to commemorate our meeting." "Wonderful idea," Patricia agreed. "Robert, get your camera." Robert retrieved his Leica from their tent, checking the film counter. He had plenty of shots left on the roll. "How about we all stand in front of your beautiful motorhome? The firelight will give us nice illumination." As both families posed together, Robert looked through the viewfinder and felt that strange sensation again, as if time itself had slowed. The Marlowes seemed to shimmer slightly in the dim light, and for just a moment he could have sworn he saw the outline of the campground behind them, as if they were somehow translucent. He blinked hard, chalked it up to fatigue from the long day, and pressed the shutter. The camera clicked, capturing what would later become the most disturbing photograph Robert Henderson would ever develop. But for now, in the warm glow of the campfire with new friends and his beloved family around him, he simply smiled and began planning the adventures tomorrow would bring. "Same time tomorrow evening?" Thomas asked, as the families began saying their goodnights. "Wouldn't miss it," Robert replied, though something deep in his subconscious was already whispering that perhaps they should. Robert woke before dawn to the sound of absolute silence. In his experience camping, there were always sounds. Insects chirping, wind rustling through leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, or the crack of settling wood in dying campfires. But now, lying in his sleeping bag beside Patricia, he heard nothing at all. The silence was so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. He quietly unzipped the tent flap and peered outside. The pre-dawn darkness was thick and impenetrable, but something was wrong with the quality of the darkness itself. It seemed too uniform, too perfect, like a black curtain had been drawn across the world. Even stranger, he couldn't see any stars through the gaps in the forest canopy, though the night had been clear when they'd gone to sleep. Across the narrow camp road, the Marlowe's motorhome sat in perfect stillness. No lights glowed from its windows, and Robert realized he couldn't remember seeing any power lines or hearing a generator running. Yet somehow the vehicle had been fully lit and functional the evening before. As he watched, a faint luminescence began to emanate from the motorhome itself, not from any windows or external lights, but from the very structure of the vehicle. The glow was so subtle, he wondered if his eyes were playing tricks on him in the darkness. Then, just as suddenly as the silence had begun, normal forest sounds resumed. Birds began their morning songs, and the familiar rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush filled the air. Robert blinked, and when he looked again toward the Marlowe's campsite, everything appeared perfectly normal. "Daddy?" Susan's small voice came from behind him. "Why are you looking outside?" Robert turned to find his youngest daughter sitting up in her sleeping bag, rubbing her eyes. "Just checking the weather, sweetheart. Go back to sleep. It's still early." But Susan was staring past him toward the Marlowe's site. "The pretty lady is standing outside her camper." Robert quickly looked back but saw no one. The Marlowe's campsite appeared empty and still in the growing dawn light. "I don't see anyone, Susan. You must have been dreaming." "She was waving at me," Susan insisted. She looked sad. A chill ran down Robert's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Come here, honey." He gathered Susan into his arms, surprised by how cold her small body felt. "Let's get you warmed up." The rest of the family woke naturally as the sun climbed higher, and soon they were busy preparing breakfast over their camp stove. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, creating a sense of normalcy that helped push away Robert's unsettling pre-dawn observations. Danny was the first to notice something odd about the Marlowe's campsite in full daylight. "Dad, look at their fire pit." Robert glanced over while flipping pancakes. The stone fire ring at the Marlowe's site showed no signs of the previous evening's fire. No ashes, no partially burned logs, no scorch marks on the stones. It looked as pristine as if it had never been used. "That's strange," Patricia murmured, following their gaze. "We all sat around that fire for hours last night." "Maybe they cleaned it up really well," Robert suggested, though he knew that was impossible. You couldn't remove every trace of a campfire that quickly or thoroughly. Thomas Marlowe emerged from the motorhome as if he'd heard them discussing his campsite. He was impeccably dressed in khakis and a button-down shirt that showed no wrinkles or signs of outdoor living. "Good morning, Henderson family. I trust you slept well?" "Very well, thank you," Patricia called back, though she noticed Eleanor and the children were nowhere to be seen. "Are your family early risers too?" "Oh, they're preparing for today's adventures," Thomas replied with that same enigmatic smile. "Eleanor is quite particular about appearances. She and the children will join us later." Danny, camera in hand, had been studying the Marlowe's motorhome in the clear morning light. "Mr. Marlowe, I've been trying to figure out what brand your RV is. I don't see any manufacturer badges or model numbers anywhere." Thomas's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes. "As I mentioned, it's a custom build. One of a kind, you might say. But even custom builds have to be based on existing chassis and components," Robert interjected. his mechanical mind unable to let the mystery go. What's the base vehicle? Ford? Chevrolet? Something much older than that, Thomas said cryptically. Some designs transcend conventional classifications. The conversation was interrupted by Susan running over to their campsite, her face bright with excitement. Mommy, Caroline showed me her dollhouse. It's inside their camper and it looks exactly like our house in Sacramento. Patricia and Robert exchanged glances. Sweetheart, are you sure? How could Caroline have a dollhouse that looks like our house? She said all houses look the same to her family, Susan explained with 8-year-old logic. But it had the same blue shutters and the same crack in the front sidewalk and everything. Before anyone could respond, Caroline Marlowe appeared beside Susan as if she had materialized from thin air. Robert was certain he hadn't seen her approach, yet there she was, smiling pleasantly and holding Susan's hand. Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, Caroline said in a voice that seemed oddly mature for her apparent age. Susan and I were just discussing the similarities between different places. Sometimes the most distant locations can seem remarkably familiar. Patricia knelt down to Caroline's level. That's very philosophical for such a young lady. How old are you, Caroline? The girl's smile never changed, but she tilted her head as if the question confused her. Age is such a relative concept, don't you think? Some days I feel very old, and others I feel as young as yesterday. Another chill ran through Robert. There was something deeply unsettling about the way this child spoke, as if she were reciting lines from a script she didn't fully understand. Throughout the rest of the morning, as both families prepared for a day of hiking and sightseeing, Robert found himself increasingly aware of small inconsistencies in the Marlowe family's behavior. They cast no shadows, despite the bright morning sun. Their footprints in the dirt seemed to fade within minutes of being made, and whenever he tried to photograph them candidly while they weren't looking, his camera malfunctioned, producing nothing but overexposed, blurred images. Yet when they posed willingly for pictures like the previous evening, his camera worked perfectly. By noon, as they all set off together for a hike to Mirror Lake, Robert had begun to keep a mental list of all the strange things he'd observed. The list was growing longer by the hour, and a terrible suspicion was beginning to form in the back of his mind. The Marlowe family was not what they appeared to be, but if they weren't a normal camping family, then what exactly had the Hendersons befriended in the wilderness of Yosemite? The trail to Mirror Lake wound through a cathedral of towering pines and granite boulders, dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above. Both families walked together, though Robert noticed the Marlowes moved with an odd, synchronized rhythm that reminded him of a military formation. Their feet seemed to barely disturb the dust on the trail, while the Hendersons left clear boot prints behind them. Danny bounded ahead with his camera, stopping frequently to photograph wildflowers, interesting rock formations, and the occasional squirrel. Michael Marlowe walked beside him, offering suggestions for better angles and lighting that seemed remarkably sophisticated for a teenager. You have quite an eye for composition, Michael told Danny as they paused beside a fallen log covered in emerald moss. Try shooting from a lower angle to capture the way the light hits the texture. Danny followed the advice and was amazed by the improvement in his shot. Wow, you're right. How did you learn so much about photography? I've been observing light and shadow for longer than you might think, Michael replied, his young face momentarily taking on an expression of infinite weariness. Behind them, Patricia and Eleanor walked arm in arm, discussing their children and sharing what appeared to be typical maternal concerns. Yet Robert, listening from a few paces back, noticed that Eleanor's stories about Caroline's childhood seemed oddly vague and contradictory. Caroline was such a precocious toddler, Eleanor was saying, though of course that seems like both yesterday and a lifetime ago. I know exactly what you mean, Patricia agreed. Sometimes I look at Susan and can't believe she was ever that tiny baby I brought home from the hospital. Hospital, Eleanor repeated as if the word were foreign to her. Oh yes, of course, hospitals. Such sterile places, don't you find? All that artificial light and the smell of... What do they use for cleaning? Patricia looked at her strangely. Disinfectant, I suppose. You must remember from when Caroline was born. Eleanor's smile became distant. Memory can be such an unreliable thing, especially when it comes to medical procedures. Thomas had fallen into step beside Robert, and their conversation had turned to more practical matters. Or so Robert thought, until Thomas began asking oddly specific questions about Sacramento. Your neighborhood must have changed considerably over the years, Thomas mused. Urban development has such a way of transforming the character of a place. We've only lived there for 5 years, Robert replied. Bought the house when Danny was 7. Of course, but I meant the broader changes. The way the city has evolved since, say, the 1940s. Robert frowned. Well, I wouldn't know about that personally. I was just a kid in the 40s living with my parents in Fresno. Thomas nodded as if Robert had confirmed something important. Children often have the clearest memories of how places really were. They see things adults miss. The conversation was interrupted by Susan's delighted squeal from up ahead. She had discovered a small creek running alongside the trail, its water so clear it seemed like liquid crystal. Caroline knelt beside her, their reflections wavering in the gentle current. "Look, Mommy," Susan called. "Caroline and I both have the same face in the water." Patricia hurried forward to see what her daughter meant, but when she looked into the creek, she saw only Susan's reflection. Caroline appeared to cast no reflection at all, though the girl was clearly kneeling right beside Susan. That's impossible," Patricia whispered. Eleanor appeared behind her, her voice soothing but firm. "Children have such wonderful imaginations, don't they? They see magic where adults see only ordinary things." When Patricia looked again, both girls' reflections were clearly visible in the water. She shook her head, wondering if the altitude was affecting her vision. As they continued toward Mirror Lake, Danny noticed that his photographs of the Marlowe family were becoming increasingly strange. When developed later, he would discover that while the backgrounds were perfectly clear and detailed, the Marlowes themselves appeared translucent, as if they were double exposed against the landscape. The trail began to level out as they approached their destination. Mirror Lake stretched before them, a perfect sheet of dark water that reflected the surrounding granite cliffs with stunning clarity. The surface was so still, it seemed like polished obsidian, broken only by the occasional ripple from a fish or water strider. "It's incredible," Robert breathed, setting down his pack and pulling out his camera. "I can see why they call it Mirror Lake." Thomas stood at the water's edge, staring into the depths with an expression that seemed almost hungry. "Mirrors can be such revealing things," he murmured. "They show us not just what is, but sometimes what was or what might be." Eleanor gathered the children around a large boulder that made a perfect natural bench. "Who would like to hear a story while your parents take their photographs?" Both Susan and Danny eagerly settled beside her, though Robert noticed that Caroline remained standing, as if she already knew the story Eleanor was about to tell. "Long ago," Eleanor began, her voice taking on a hypnotic quality, "there were families who traveled these mountains before any roads existed, before any campgrounds were built. They came seeking something that couldn't be found in the civilized world." "What were they looking for?" Susan asked, her eyes wide with fascination. "Connection," Eleanor replied mysteriously. "A way to bridge the gap between what they had lost and what they hoped to find again." Patricia felt a sudden chill despite the warm afternoon sun. There was something in Eleanor's tone that suggested she wasn't talking about historical pioneers, but about something far more personal and immediate. Robert was adjusting his camera settings when he noticed something disturbing in Mirror Lake's reflection. While the surrounding landscape appeared normal in the water's surface, the area where the Marlowe family stood showed something entirely different. Instead of the modern figures he saw with his naked eye, the reflection showed what appeared to be people in much older clothing, their faces gaunt and their eyes filled with a desperate, haunting sadness. He blinked hard and looked again, but now the reflection matched reality perfectly. The Marlowes appeared as they had all day, a pleasant, well-dressed family enjoying a camping trip. But the image he'd glimpsed in that brief moment remained burned into his memory. Those reflected faces had looked at him across the mirror-like surface of the lake with an expression of such profound longing that it made his chest tighten with inexplicable sorrow. "Dad?" Danny's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Dad, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Robert forced a smile, though his hands were trembling slightly as he lowered his camera. "Just the altitude, son. Sometimes the thin air can make you feel a bit strange." But as they began the hike back to camp later that afternoon, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that Danny's casual comment had been far more accurate than either of them realized. He was beginning to suspect that he had indeed seen ghosts. The question that haunted him with each step back toward the campground was whether the Marlowe family knew what they really were, or if they were as trapped in their strange existence as the Hendersons were becoming trapped in this increasingly surreal encounter. That evening, as both families gathered once again around the Marlowe's mysteriously pristine fire pit, Robert found himself studying his new neighbors with the intensity of a detective examining evidence. The flames danced between them, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of the people who should have been creating them. Patricia had prepared s'mores for everyone, a camping tradition she'd been excited to share. But when she offered the chocolate and marshmallow treats to the Marlowe family, their reactions were peculiar. They accepted the s'mores politely, held them carefully, and even brought them to their lips. But Robert never actually saw any of them take a bite. "These are delicious," Eleanor said, though the marshmallow on her stick remained untouched and perfectly golden. "Such a wonderful tradition." "It's one of the best parts of camping," Patricia agreed, watching with growing confusion as Eleanor continued to hold her s'more without eating it. "Don't they get messy, though? The chocolate always melts on my fingers." Eleanor looked down at her hands with an expression of mild surprise, as if she'd forgotten she was holding anything at all. "Oh yes, quite messy," she agreed, though her fingers remained spotless. The children seemed unaware of the adults' strange behavior. Danny and Michael were deep in conversation about photography techniques, while Susan and Caroline played a clapping game that involved an increasingly complex series of rhythmic patterns. What disturbed Robert was that both girls seemed to know the intricate rhythm instinctively, as if they'd played it together countless times before. "Where did you learn that game, Susan?" Robert asked during a break in the pattern. "Caroline taught it to me," Susan replied happily. "She said it's very old from when her family used to travel a lot." Caroline's expression grew distant. "We've always been traveling," she said, in that eerily mature voice. "Sometimes I think we've been on the road longer than anyone remembers." Thomas, who had been staring into the fire with unusual intensity, suddenly looked up. "Robert, you mentioned you work with your hands. There's something about craftsmanship that transcends time, don't you think? The skill passes from generation to generation, almost like genetic memory." "I suppose so," Robert replied cautiously, "though I learned most of what I know from trial and error, not from my father." "Ah, but perhaps the knowledge was there all along, waiting to be awakened," Thomas suggested. "Sometimes we carry more from our ancestors than we realize." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made everyone freeze. From somewhere deep in the forest came a low, mournful wailing that seemed to rise and fall like a lament. It was unlike any animal call Robert had ever heard, and it seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "What was that?" Patricia whispered, instinctively moving closer to Robert. "Just the wind," Eleanor said quickly, but her composed demeanor had cracked slightly. "Mountain winds can create the most unusual sounds as they move through the rock formations." But there was no wind. The air was perfectly still, and the flames of their fire burned straight upward without even the slightest flicker. The wailing came again, closer this time, and with it came an overwhelming sense of sadness that seemed to press down on them like a physical weight. Susan began to cry, though she couldn't explain why, and Danny's face went pale as he clutched his camera. "I think we should head back to our tent," Robert said, standing and helping Patricia to her feet. The oppressive sorrow in the air was becoming unbearable. "Of course," Thomas agreed, though he made no move to stand. "Rest well, Henderson family. Tomorrow will be another interesting day." As they walked the short distance back to their campsite, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that the Marlowe family was watching them go with expressions of infinite longing. When he glanced back, all four figures were still seated around the fire, perfectly motionless like a tableau frozen in time. That night, Robert's dreams were filled with impossible images. He saw the Yosemite Campground as it might have looked decades earlier, filled with families in older clothing driving vehicles from bygone eras. In his dream, the Marlowe's motorhome appeared among these vintage scenes, looking exactly the same as it did now, while everything else around it aged and changed. He dreamed of Mirror Lake, but instead of reflecting the sky and mountains, its surface showed scenes from different time periods, layered one upon another like double-exposed photographs. In the deepest layer, he saw a family that looked remarkably like the Marlowes, but their clothes were from the 1940s, and their faces were filled with a desperate urgency as they searched for something among the trees. Patricia's sleep was disturbed by different visions. She found herself standing outside their tent in the middle of the night, drawn by the sound of a woman softly singing. Following the melody, she walked toward the Marlowe's campsite, where she saw Eleanor standing beside the mysterious motorhome, her perfect composure finally broken. Eleanor was weeping, and her tears seemed to glow with a faint silvery light as they fell to the ground. When they hit the earth, they made no sound and left no trace, as if they were composed of something other than water. "They can't stay much longer," Eleanor was saying to someone Patricia couldn't see. "The connection is growing too strong. The children are beginning to remember." Patricia tried to speak, to ask what Eleanor meant, but found she had no voice in this dreamlike state. She could only watch as Eleanor's form became increasingly translucent until she was little more than a shimmer in the darkness. Meanwhile, in the tent beside his parents, Danny was having the most disturbing dream of all. He was looking through his camera viewfinder at the campground, but instead of seeing the familiar scene, he saw layer upon layer of different time periods occupying the same space simultaneously. Families from the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s were all camping in the exact same spots, their activities overlapping and interweaving like multiple film reels playing at once. And in every single time period, he could see the Marlowe family, unchanged and unchanging, moving between the decades as if time itself meant nothing to them. In his dream, Danny pressed the shutter, and the resulting photograph showed not just the present moment, but every moment that had ever occurred in that location. The image was a palimpsest of human experience, with the Marlowes serving as the only constant thread connecting all the different eras. When the Henderson family woke the next morning, they were all exhausted and deeply unsettled, though none of them immediately shared their troubling dreams. But as they prepared breakfast and went through their normal morning routine, each of them kept glancing toward the Marlowe's campsite with a new sense of unease. The motorhome sat silent and still in the morning light, its windows dark and revealing nothing of what might be happening inside. For the first time since their arrival at Yosemite, Robert found himself hoping that their mysterious neighbors would decide to break camp and continue their journey to wherever families like the Marlowes really belonged. But something deep in his gut told him that wasn't going to happen. The Marlowes had found what they were looking for in the Henderson family, and Robert was beginning to fear what that might mean for his wife and children. The morning air felt different as Robert stepped outside their tent, heavier somehow, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened overnight. The usual sounds of the campground were muted, and he noticed that several neighboring campsites that had been occupied the previous day now stood empty, their former occupants having departed without a trace. More disturbing still, when Robert looked toward the Marlowe's campsite, he could see straight through their motorhome to the trees beyond, as if the vehicle was slowly becoming transparent. He rubbed his eyes hard, certain that fatigue was playing tricks on his vision, but when he looked again, the effect was even more pronounced. "Robert?" Patricia's voice came from behind him, tight with fear. "I need to tell you about the dream I had last night." As they huddled together outside their tent, speaking in whispers so as not to wake the children, Patricia recounted her vision of Eleanor weeping beside the motorhome. Robert listened with growing alarm, especially when she mentioned Eleanor's cryptic words about the children beginning to remember. "That's not all," Robert admitted. "I've been noticing things about them that don't add up. The way they don't eat, how their fire pit shows no signs of use, the fact that my camera malfunctions when I try to photograph them candidly." Before Patricia could respond, Danny emerged from the tent, his young face pale and drawn. "Dad, Mom, I had the strangest dream about taking pictures of different time periods all mixed up together." Susan followed close behind, clutching Mr. Buttons and looking younger than her 8 years. "The lady from across the road was in my dreams too. She kept saying she was sorry over and over." A chill ran down Robert's spine. The fact that all 4 family members had experienced supernatural dreams on the same night couldn't be a coincidence. Something was building toward a climax, and he had the terrible feeling that his family was running out of time to escape whatever the Marlowes represented. "Pack up the camp," Robert said quietly but firmly. "We're leaving. Now." "But Daddy," Susan protested, "we haven't said goodbye to Caroline." "There's no time for goodbyes, sweetheart. We need to go home." As they began hastily breaking down their campsite, Robert became aware that they were being watched. Across the narrow road, Thomas Marlowe stood motionless beside his increasingly transparent motorhome, his expression a mixture of sadness and something that might have been hunger. Eleanor appeared beside her husband, her perfect composure finally completely shattered. Her hair hung loose and disheveled, her clothes seemed to be from an earlier era, and her face bore an expression of desperate pleading. "You can't leave yet," Eleanor called across to them, her voice carrying easily despite the distance. "We haven't finished what we started." Robert looked up from rolling their sleeping bags, his jaw set with determination. "We don't know what you want, but whatever it is, we can't give it to you." Thomas stepped forward, and as he did, his appearance began to shift and flicker like a badly tuned television. One moment he looked like the sophisticated man they'd met 2 days earlier. The next he appeared to be wearing clothes from the 1940s, his face gaunt with starvation and his eyes hollow with desperation. "You don't understand," Thomas said, his voice now carrying a strange echo. "We've been searching for so long, traveling these roads, visiting these places, looking for a family like yours." "Like ours how?" Patricia demanded, stepping protectively in front of Susan. Eleanor's form was becoming more transparent by the moment, but her voice grew stronger and more urgent. "A family with children who can see, who can remember. Children who might be able to help us find our way back." Danny, still clutching his camera, suddenly understood with the clarity that sometimes comes to young minds. "Back to what? Back to when you were alive?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Neither Thomas nor Eleanor denied it, and their silence was confirmation enough. "The motorhome," Robert said slowly, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "It was never manufactured because it doesn't exist. It's some kind of vessel, isn't it? A way for you to move between times, between places." Thomas nodded sadly. "We died in 1943, a family camping trip that went terribly wrong. A storm, a flash flood that came out of nowhere. We were swept away before we could save ourselves or our children." Caroline and Michael materialized beside their parents, and now their true ages were apparent. They were children from the 1940s, their clothes and hairstyles from a different era, their faces bearing the timeless quality of those who have been frozen between life and death for decades. "We've been traveling ever since," Caroline said in her eerily adult voice, "searching for a way to complete our journey, to find the peace that was stolen from us." "And you think we can help you how?" Robert asked, though he was beginning to suspect he knew the answer. Eleanor's transparent form flickered like a candle in the wind. "Your children have the gift. They can see us as we truly are. With their help, we might finally be able to cross over, to find the rest we've been seeking for 21 years. "But what happens to our children?" Patricia's voice was fierce with maternal protection. The silence that followed was answer enough. Robert understood now why so many campsites had emptied overnight. Other families had sensed the danger and fled, following instincts older than civilization itself. "No," Robert said firmly, pulling his family closer together. "Whatever you're asking, whatever you need, we can't help you. I won't risk my children's lives for your peace." Thomas's form began to shift more violently, cycling through different appearances as his desperation grew. "You don't understand what it's like. 21 years of wandering, of never being able to rest, of watching the world change around us while we remain trapped in the moment of our death. I'm sorry for what happened to you," Robert said, his voice softening with genuine compassion. "But my family is not the answer to your problem." Eleanor let out a wail that seemed to come from the very depths of despair, and the sound was answered by that same mournful crying they'd heard the night before. But now, Robert realized it wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from the Marlowe family themselves, the sound of souls who had been lost for far too long. As the crying grew louder, the morning light began to dim, as if the very presence of the trapped family was drawing the life out of the day itself. Robert knew they had perhaps minutes to escape, before something irreversible occurred. "Run!" he whispered to his family. "Get to the car! Now!" But as they turned toward their packed station wagon, they found their way blocked by the translucent forms of dozens of other families, all dressed in clothing from different eras, all bearing the same hollow, desperate expression as the Marlowes. The Hendersons were surrounded by the lost, and their vacation in paradise had become a nightmare from which there might be no escape. The air around the Henderson family grew thick and oppressive as the ghostly figures materialized from the morning mist. Families from different decades formed a loose circle around them, a 1920s family in their Model T Ford touring car, their faces bearing the hollow stare of those who had perished in a mountain landslide, a 1950s family beside their Airstream trailer, still wearing the clothes they'd died in during a carbon monoxide leak, parents and children from the Depression era, their forms flickering like old film reels, casualties of winter storms that had caught them unprepared. Each family bore the unmistakable mark of tragedy, and all of them looked at the living Henderson family with the same desperate longing that Robert had seen in the Marlowe's eyes. Danny raised his camera instinctively, and for the first time since meeting the Marlowes, the device worked perfectly. Through the viewfinder, he could see the assembled spirits with crystal clarity, their forms more solid and defined than they appeared to the naked eye. More disturbing still, he could see the threads of ethereal energy connecting them all, like a vast web with the Henderson family trapped at its center. "There are so many of them," Patricia whispered, her voice barely audible above the collective sighing of the lost souls. Thomas Marlowe stepped forward, his form now completely transparent, except for his eyes, which burned with an inner light. "You see now why you can't simply leave. This gathering happens perhaps once in a generation, when a family like yours arrives at just the right time and place. What makes our family so special? Robert demanded, though he kept his voice calm to avoid frightening Susan, who was pressing against his leg and shaking visibly. Eleanor's ghost drifted closer, her ethereal form leaving frost patterns in the air where she passed. Your children carry something rare in this modern age. They can see beyond the veil between worlds. More importantly, they can remember what they've seen. Michael Marlowe, appearing now as the teenage boy he'd been when he died in 1943, pointed at Danny's camera. That device will capture more than just images. In the hands of someone with the gift, it can record the connection between the living and the dead. And what happens when that connection is recorded? Robert asked, though he dreaded the answer. The spirit of a woman in 1930s clothing stepped forward from the circle. Her family had apparently perished in their canvas tent during a winter storm, and ice crystals still clung to her hair and dress. The recording becomes a bridge, she explained, in a voice like wind through dry leaves, a way for us to finally cross over from this endless wandering to whatever lies beyond. But crossing over requires energy, added the ghost of a man in 1950s camping attire. Life force that must come from the living. The horrible truth crashed over Robert like a cold wave. You want to drain our life force to power your escape from this existence. Caroline Marlowe, her child's face bearing wisdom far beyond her years, nodded sadly. Not all of it. Not enough to kill you. Just enough to weaken the barrier between worlds so we can pass through. Just enough to trap us here with you, Patricia said with sudden understanding. That's how this cycle perpetuates, isn't it? You drain enough life force to cross over, but in the process you create new spirits to take your place. The silence that followed confirmed her terrible realization. The campground had become a supernatural trap, a place where the desperate dead preyed upon the living in an endless cycle of tragedy. Susan, who had been quietly observing the ghostly assembly, suddenly spoke up in her small, clear voice. But you're all still sad. Even if you take what you need from us, you'll still be sad. Eleanor's transparent form knelt down to Susan's eye level. What do you mean, child? I can see inside you, Susan said with the matter-of-fact tone that children use when stating obvious truths. You're not sad because you can't cross over. You're sad because you left people behind. Taking our energy won't fix that sadness. The assembled spirits seemed to waver, their forms becoming even more translucent as Susan's words sank in. She's right, Danny said suddenly, looking up from his camera. I can see it too, through the lens. You're not trapped here because you died. You're trapped here because you can't let go of the guilt. Thomas Marlowe's form flickered violently. Guilt? We were victims. We died through no fault of our own. But you left people behind who loved you, Susan continued with devastating childhood honesty. Parents, brothers, sisters, friends. And instead of going to them, you've been hiding here, trying to find a way to avoid facing them. The ghostly assembly began to shift restlessly, their unified purpose wavering in the face of this simple truth spoken by a child. Eleanor's voice cracked with emotion. How can we face them? How can we explain that we failed to protect our children, that we couldn't save ourselves, that we made so many mistakes? The same way living people do, Patricia said softly, her maternal instincts overcoming her fear, with love and forgiveness. Robert saw his opportunity in the spirit's momentary confusion. You don't need our life force to cross over. You need the courage to face whatever comes next, knowing that the people who loved you will still love you, mistakes and all. The circle of ghosts began to waver, some spirits becoming more translucent, while others seemed to solidify slightly. The unity of their supernatural trap was breaking apart as individual souls began to question their long-held assumptions about their fate. But not all of the spirits were ready to accept this revelation. A group of the older ghosts, led by a grim-faced man in 1920s attire, pressed closer to the Henderson family. Enough of this philosophical nonsense, the 1920s ghost snarled. We've waited decades for a family like this. I won't be denied my rest because of pretty words about love and forgiveness. The morning air grew colder as the more desperate spirits prepared to take by force what they believed they needed to escape their endless wandering. The Henderson family found themselves caught between the ghosts who were beginning to question their methods and those who were beyond caring about right and wrong. The supernatural battle for their souls was about to begin, and Robert realized that their only weapons were the very human qualities of love, courage and faith that the dead had forgotten in their decades of despair. The temperature around the Henderson family plummeted as the more desperate spirits began to advance. Frost formed on the picnic table and their camping gear, and their breath became visible in sharp puffs, as the air itself seemed to freeze around the gathering supernatural forces. The 1920s ghost who had spoken earlier raised his translucent hand, and tendrils of icy mist began to flow toward Danny, drawn by some invisible force to his camera. "The boy's device will serve as our conduit," the spirit declared. "Through it, we can anchor ourselves to the living world long enough to drain what we need." But as the ghostly mist reached for Danny, Susan stepped forward with surprising boldness for an 8-year-old child. "You're being mean," she declared, her small voice carrying unexpected authority. "Caroline told me about how sad she was when her family got lost in the water. Don't you remember being scared too?" Caroline Marlowe's spirit flickered, her child's form becoming more solid as Susan's words awakened buried emotions. I do remember being scared, so very scared, when the water came rushing toward us." Eleanor's ghostly form moved protectively toward her daughter, even in death retaining her maternal instincts. "Caroline, don't listen to them. We're so close to finding peace." "But are we?" Caroline asked, her voice carrying a wisdom that transcended her apparent age. "I don't feel peaceful. I feel angry and hungry and cold all the time. Is that really better than being scared?" The divide among the spirits became more pronounced as Caroline's question rippled through the assembled ghosts. Some began to waver, their forms becoming less solid as doubt crept into their long-held convictions about their fate. Thomas Marlowe stepped between his family and the more aggressive spirits. "Perhaps we should reconsider. These people have shown us kindness, and their children speak truths we haven't wanted to hear." "Kindness?" The 1920s ghost laughed bitterly, the sound like wind through dead leaves. "Where was kindness when we needed it? Where was help when we were dying? These living creatures have what we lost, and I intend to take it." The hostile spirit lunged forward, his form becoming more solid with desperate purpose. Robert instinctively stepped in front of his family, though he had no idea how to fight a ghost. But as the spirit's icy touch reached for him, Patricia did something unexpected. She began to sing. It was a simple lullaby, one she had sung to her children when they were babies, but her voice carried all the love and protection a mother could offer. The melody seemed to create a barrier of warmth around the Henderson family, and the advancing ghost recoiled as if burned. "Music!" Eleanor whispered in amazement. "I had forgotten about music." Other spirits in the circle began to remember too. A 1930s woman started humming along with Patricia's lullaby, and a man from the 1950s began to weep as he recalled songs his own children had loved. The power of these memories began to work against the supernatural trap that had held them for decades. Danny, still clutching his camera, noticed something remarkable happening through his viewfinder. As the spirits remembered their humanity, the dark threads connecting them to the living world began to dissolve, replaced by golden strands that seemed to reach upward towards something beyond the visible realm. "Look," he called out, pointing his camera skyward. "Look up there." Even without the camera, the others could now see what Danny had spotted. High above the campground, the morning sky was beginning to shimmer with an otherworldly light. Faces were becoming visible in the luminescence, the faces of people who had been waiting decades for their lost loved ones to find the courage to join them. "Mama," Caroline whispered, staring upward with wonder. "Is that really you, Mama?" An elderly woman's face smiled down from the light, her expression filled with infinite love and patience. She nodded to Caroline, and her lips moved in words only the child could hear. Eleanor gasped, her own face transforming with recognition and joy. "Mother, you waited for us all this time you waited." The 1920s ghost, who had been so determined to drain the Henderson family's life force, suddenly stopped his advance. In the light above, he too had spotted familiar faces, loved ones who had passed on years before his own death and who had been waiting for him to let go of his earthly rage. "Sarah," he whispered, his hostile demeanor cracking. "Sarah, my darling, is that you?" One by one, the assembled spirits began to recognize the faces in the light. Parents, grandparents, siblings, friends, all waiting with expressions of welcome rather than judgment. The supernatural trap that had held them to the campground for so many decades was breaking apart as love proved stronger than fear. But the transformation wasn't without resistance. The darkest spirits, those who had been trapped the longest, fought against the pull of the light. They had invested too much in their anger and desperation to let go easily. "No!" screamed a ghostly woman whose family had died in the 1910s. "I won't go until I have justice. I won't leave until someone pays for what was taken from us." Her rage created a vortex of cold air that threatened to drag the Henderson family into the supernatural maelstrom. Robert felt his strength being drawn away as the vengeful spirit's fury intensified. But Susan, with the fearlessness that only children possess, walked directly toward the raging ghost. "Nobody took anything from you," she said simply. "Sometimes bad things just happen. But your family is up there waiting for you, and they look happy to see you." The spirit's fury faltered as she looked up at the light and saw, for the first time, the faces of her own parents, smiling down with nothing but love in their eyes. They're not angry with me," she whispered. "Why would they be angry?" Susan asked. "You didn't do anything wrong. You just got lost for a while." The woman's ghostly form began to dissolve into sparkling motes of light that rose upward toward the waiting faces. As she ascended, her expression transformed from rage to wonder to profound relief. All around the campground, similar transformations were taking place. The trapped spirits were finally finding the courage to face their loved ones, to accept forgiveness for imagined failures, and to continue the journey that death had interrupted, but not ended. The Henderson family watched in awe as the supernatural assembly that had threatened them just minutes earlier dissolved into ascending lights, each spirit finding peace at last through the simple act of remembering love rather than clinging to fear. But their ordeal wasn't over yet. The Marlowe family remained, and Robert could see that Thomas was struggling with his own decision about whether to let go or make one final desperate attempt to change their fate. As the last of the other spirits ascended into the luminous sky, the campground fell into an eerie quiet. Only the Marlowe family remained, their translucent forms flickering uncertainly as they watched their fellow ghosts find the peace that had eluded them all for decades. Thomas stood motionless beside their impossible motorhome, which was now so transparent it was barely visible. His face was a battlefield of conflicting emotions, hope warring with desperation, love struggling against fear. Eleanor moved closer to her husband, her ghostly hand reaching for his. "Thomas, did you see them? Did you see how happy they looked when they were reunited with their families?" "I saw," Thomas replied, his voice heavy with 21 years of accumulated sorrow. "But Eleanor, what if we're different? What if there's no one waiting for us up there?" Caroline and Michael stood close together, their child faces bearing expressions far too mature for their apparent ages. They had been dead longer than they had been alive, trapped in this liminal existence while the world moved on without them. "There has to be someone," Michael said quietly. "Grandpa Henderson, maybe, or Great-Aunt Martha. They loved us when we were little." Danny, still looking through his camera viewfinder, suddenly gasped. "There are people up there waiting for you. I can see them." He handed the camera to Caroline, who peered through the lens with wonder. "Grandpa, oh, Grandpa Henderson, you look just like I remember." Her ghostly form began to brighten with joy, but then dimmed again as she looked at her parents. "But Mama, Papa, what if you're not ready? What if we go up there and you're still sad?" Eleanor knelt beside her daughter, her translucent form shimmering with unshed tears. "Sweet Caroline, I've been sad for so long that I've forgotten what it feels like to be anything else. Maybe it's time to try." Thomas watched his family with growing amazement as they began to accept what the other spirits had already discovered. But he remained frozen by his own fears and regrets. "I failed them," he said suddenly, looking directly at Robert. "I was supposed to protect my family, and I failed. The storm came so fast, the water was so cold and powerful. I couldn't save them. I couldn't even save myself." Robert stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Thomas, I'm a father too. I understand the weight of that responsibility. But sometimes things happen that are beyond our control. The measure of a man isn't whether he can prevent every tragedy, it's whether he loves his family enough to face whatever comes." Patricia nodded in agreement. "You didn't fail them, Thomas. You've spent 21 years trying to find a way to make things right. That's not failure, that's love." Susan, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation, walked over to the ghostly family. "Mr. Thomas, are you afraid your family won't forgive you?" Thomas looked down at the 8-year-old girl, his spectral features softening. "Among other things, yes. But they're right here," Susan said matter-of-factly, gesturing to Eleanor and the children. "And they don't look mad at you. They look like they love you very much." Eleanor's form became more solid as she moved to her husband's side. "Thomas, she's right. I'm not angry with you. I never was. The only thing that's kept me from peace all these years is watching you torture yourself with guilt that was never yours to carry." Michael stepped forward, his teenage form flickering with remembered life. "Dad, I don't remember being afraid when the flood came. I remember you trying to reach us, calling our names, fighting the current to get to us. You didn't fail us. You loved us until the very last moment." Caroline nodded emphatically, "And we felt that love, Papa. Even when the water was pulling us away, we felt how much you loved us." Thomas's ghostly form began to tremble as decades of self-imposed guilt started to crack and crumble. "But if I had been stronger, smarter, more prepared, then maybe you would have died trying," Robert interjected, "and your family would have spent eternity blaming themselves for your death instead of you blaming yourself for theirs. Guilt is just love with nowhere to go, Thomas. It's time to let that love find its proper destination." Danny, who had been quietly observing through his camera, suddenly pointed upward. "Look, there's a whole group of people waiting up there for your family. They're all smiling and waving." Through the camera lens, the assembled spirits could see their extended family and friends gathered in the light, their faces radiant with welcome. But more importantly, they could see that none of those faces held anger or disappointment, only love and the joy of long-awaited reunion. Thomas finally looked up, and when he saw his own father's face beaming down at him with pride rather than judgment, the last of his resistance crumbled. "Papa," he whispered, "you're not ashamed of me?" The face in the light shook its head and mouthed words that seemed to reach directly into Thomas's heart. "My son, I'm proud of the father you became and the love you showed your family." Eleanor felt the change in her husband immediately. His form began to solidify and brighten as he finally released the burden he had carried for more than 2 decades. "Are you ready?" Eleanor asked, taking his hand. Thomas looked around the campground one last time, then at the Henderson family who had shown them such kindness and wisdom. "Thank you," he said simply, "for helping us remember what we had forgotten." Caroline ran to Susan and gave her a ghostly hug that felt like cool morning mist. "Thank you for being my friend. I hope you have wonderful adventures with your family." Michael shook hands with Danny in the formal way of 1940s teenagers. "Take good pictures. Capture the moments that matter." As the Marlowe family joined hands and began to rise toward the light, their forms became increasingly radiant. The impossible motorhome finally faded completely, leaving no trace that it had ever existed except in Robert's camera and in the memories of one living family who had helped the dead find peace. The last thing the Hendersons heard was Caroline's voice, now filled with joy instead of sorrow, calling back to them as she ascended. "Don't forget us. Remember that love is stronger than anything, even death." And then they were gone, reunited at last with the loved ones who had been waiting patiently for them to find the courage to come home. The Henderson family stood alone in the campground as the supernatural light faded and normal morning sunlight returned. The air warmed, the frost disappeared, and the sounds of ordinary camping life resumed around them. But they would never be quite the same, having learned that love transcends death, that guilt can trap souls more securely than any earthly prison, and that sometimes the greatest gift one can give is simply the courage to let go. 3 weeks had passed since the Henderson family returned from Yosemite, but the memory of their supernatural encounter remained as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. Robert had developed all of Danny's film from the trip, but he had deliberately saved his own role for last. Uncertain of what he might find, when the images emerged from the chemical baths in his makeshift darkroom. The basement of their Sacramento home had been converted into a photography studio years earlier, complete with enlarger, developing trays, and red safety lights that cast everything in an otherworldly glow. It seemed fitting that he would discover the truth about their camping trip in this shadowy, liminal space between light and darkness. Patricia sat on the wooden stool beside his workbench, watching nervously as Robert carefully removed the developed negatives from the fixer solution. Danny and Susan were upstairs doing homework, but their voices drifted down through the basement ceiling, a comforting reminder of normal family life. "Are you sure you want to see this?" Robert asked, holding the strip of negatives up to the red light. He could make out shapes and figures, but the details weren't clear until he made proper prints. "We have to know," Patricia replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "We have to know if what we experienced was real, or if we all somehow shared the same impossible dream." Robert nodded and began the printing process, starting with the photographs from their first day at the campground. The images appeared normal, their family setting up camp, the children playing, Patricia organizing their supplies. Everything looked exactly as he remembered it, but when he reached the photograph he'd taken of both families together in front of the Marlowe's motorhome, his hands began to shake. The Henderson family appeared perfectly normal in the image, standing together and smiling at the camera. But where the Marlowe family should have been, there were only translucent, shimmering figures that seemed to be composed of light and shadow rather than solid matter. The motorhome behind them was clearly visible in the photograph, but it appeared to be made of the same ethereal substance as its occupants. "My God," Patricia whispered, leaning closer to examine the print. "They really were ghosts. It wasn't our imagination." But that wasn't the most disturbing aspect of the photograph. As Robert studied the image more closely, he noticed details that hadn't been visible to the naked eye during their encounter. In the background, partially hidden among the trees, dozens of other translucent figures could be seen watching the two families. The lost spirits who would later surround them had been there from the very beginning, drawn by the presence of living children who possessed the rare gift of sight. "Look at this," Robert said, pointing to another unsettling detail. "The ground around the motorhome. There are no tire tracks, no impression marks from the vehicle's weight. It's as if it was never really there at all." Patricia examined the area he indicated and felt a chill run down her spine. The earth beneath and around the impossible motorhome was completely undisturbed, covered with a natural layer of pine needles and forest debris that would have been compressed or displaced by any real vehicle. Robert continued printing the rest of the photographs from their camping trip. The images from their hike to Mirror Lake showed the Henderson family clearly, but the Marlowes appeared as ghostly double exposures, sometimes visible and sometimes completely transparent. In several shots, Robert could see through their forms to the landscape behind them. Most remarkably, the photographs seemed to capture the emotional state of the spirits as well as their physical appearance. In the early images, the Marlowe family appeared solid and well-defined, as if their desperate desire to seem normal had given them temporary substance. But as the trip progressed and their true nature became harder to conceal, their forms in the photographs became increasingly translucent and ethereal. The final photograph Robert had taken, just before the spirits ascended into the light, showed something extraordinary. The Marlowe family appeared radiant and joyful, their forms glowing with an inner light, as they prepared to reunite with their loved ones. Behind them, the light from the sky was visible in the photograph, and within that luminescence, Robert could just make out the faces of the family members who had been waiting for them. "It's all here," Patricia said in amazement. "Everything we saw, everything we experienced. It's all recorded in these photographs." Robert nodded, but his expression was troubled. "The question is, what do we do with them? Who would believe us if we showed these images to anyone?" Before Patricia could answer, they heard footsteps on the basement stairs. Danny appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of their voices and his own curiosity about what the photographs might reveal. "Dad, did the pictures come out okay?" he asked, then stopped short when he saw the developed images spread across the workbench. "Wow, they really were ghosts, weren't they?" Robert gathered his son into a protective embrace. "Yes, they were, but they're at peace now, thanks in part to you and Susan. You both showed remarkable courage and wisdom." Danny studied the photographs with the intense focus he brought to all things related to photography. "Dad, look at this one," he said, pointing to an image Robert hadn't examined closely yet. "This was taken right after we met them the first night." The photograph showed both families around the Marlowe's campfire, but there was something extraordinary about the image that hadn't been visible to the living eye. Threads of golden light connected the Henderson children to the Marlowe family, particularly to Caroline and Michael. The connections looked like streams of compassion and understanding flowing between the living and the dead. "I think that's why they were drawn to us," Danny said with insight beyond his years. "Susan and I could see them, but more than that, we could feel their sadness and loneliness. They needed someone who could understand their pain." Patricia looked at her son with newfound respect. "You're probably right, and in the end, understanding their pain was what helped them find peace." Robert carefully gathered all the photographs and negatives, handling them like the precious historical documents they had become. "These images are proof that love transcends death, that the bonds between family members survive even the most tragic circumstances." "Are you going to show them to anyone?" Danny asked. Robert considered the question carefully. "Someday, perhaps, when we're ready to share this story with the world. But for now, they're our family's secret, a reminder of the weekend we helped lost souls find their way home." As they prepared to leave the darkroom, Patricia took one last look at the photograph of both families together. Despite knowing the truth about the Marlowe's supernatural nature, she felt no fear when she looked at their ghostly forms. Instead, She felt grateful for the opportunity to have known them even briefly and to have played a part in their long-awaited reunion with their loved ones. The photographs would be carefully preserved, along with the memories of their extraordinary camping trip, and someday, when the time was right, the Henderson family would share their story with others who needed to know that death was not an ending, but simply another beginning in the endless journey of love. 6 months had passed since their encounter at Yosemite, and the Henderson family had settled into a new normal that included the weight of their extraordinary secret. But secrets, Robert was learning, had a way of seeking the light, much like the spirits they had helped find peace. The first sign that their experience was having broader implications came on a crisp October morning when Robert received an unexpected phone call at the lumber yard where he worked. "Mr. Henderson, my name is Margaret Whitfield. I'm calling from the Yosemite Park Service. We understand you and your family camped at our facility in July, and we'd like to ask you a few questions if you have time." Robert felt his heart rate quicken. "What kind of questions?" "Well, this might sound unusual, but we've had several reports from campers over the past few months about unexplained phenomena in that particular section of the campground. Families claiming to see other campers who weren't officially registered, vehicles that don't match any known manufacturers, that sort of thing." Robert's grip tightened on the phone receiver. "I see. The interesting thing is, these reports have dropped off completely since late July. It's as if whatever was happening there simply stopped. Your family was among the last to camp in that area before the phenomena ceased, so we're hoping you might have observed something that could help us understand what was going on." After a long pause, Robert made a decision that would change their lives. "Ms. Whitfield, I think you and I need to have a conversation, but not over the phone. Would it be possible for you to come to Sacramento?" 3 days later, Margaret Whitfield sat in the Henderson family living room, staring in amazement at the photographs spread across the coffee table. She was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that had seen enough unusual things during her Park Service career to keep her mind open to possibilities others might dismiss. "These are remarkable," she said, examining the image of both families with a magnifying glass. "I've never seen anything quite like them. The technical quality is excellent, but the content—" She shook her head in wonder. Patricia served coffee while Danny and Susan sat quietly on the couch, having been briefed about the importance of this meeting. The family had agreed that it was time to share their story with someone in authority, someone who might be able to help other families avoid the potentially dangerous encounter they had experienced. "The phenomena at that campground go back decades," Margaret explained as she continued studying the photographs. "We have reports dating to the 1940s of campers seeing families and vehicles that shouldn't exist. But the incidents were always sporadic, and most people assumed they were seeing things due to altitude, fatigue, or too much time around the campfire." "What changed?" Robert asked. "The frequency increased dramatically over the past few years. We started getting reports almost weekly during the camping season. Some families packed up and left in the middle of the night, claiming they felt threatened or drained of energy. Others reported missing time, periods where hours would pass without their awareness." Susan, who had been listening intently despite her young age, suddenly spoke up. "Were the ghost families getting hungrier?" Margaret looked at the 8-year-old with surprise. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "The Marlowes told us they had been searching for a long time," Susan explained with her characteristic directness. "Maybe they were getting desperate because they had been lost for so many years. That's why they were trying harder to find families who could help them." Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. "That's a remarkably insightful observation, and it would explain why the phenomena stopped so abruptly after your encounter. If these spirits found what they were looking for—" "They found peace," Danny finished. "All of them. Not just the Marlowes, but dozens of other ghost families who had been trapped there." Margaret spent the next several hours listening to the Henderson family recount their entire experience in detail. She took careful notes, asked thoughtful questions, and examined each photograph with the thoroughness of a trained investigator. "I believe you," she said finally, sitting back in her chair. "I've worked in these mountains for 25 years, and I've seen enough unexplained things to know that our understanding of reality has significant gaps. More importantly, your story explains patterns we've been observing for decades." Robert leaned forward. "What happens now? Do you report this to your superiors? Do we become subjects of some kind of government investigation?" Margaret smiled. "Actually, the Park Service has a quiet division that handles what we diplomatically call unusual natural phenomena. We've learned over the years that some places hold memories, that traumatic events can leave impressions on the landscape itself. Your family's experience will be documented and filed, but discreetly. And the campground? Patricia asked. We'll continue monitoring it, but frankly, I suspect the problem has been permanently resolved. When spirits find peace, they don't return to haunt the places where they were trapped. Before Margaret left that afternoon, she made an unexpected request. Would you be willing to speak with other families who have had similar experiences? Not as part of any official investigation, but as people who understand what it's like to encounter the supernatural and live to tell about it. Robert and Patricia exchanged glances. They had found their calling, their way to use their extraordinary experience to help others. We'd be honored, Patricia said. Over the following months, the Henderson family began receiving visitors. Families who had encountered unexplained phenomena in various locations, people who had seen loved ones after death, individuals who carried the burden of supernatural experiences they couldn't share with anyone who would believe them. The Henderson home became an unofficial haven for those who had crossed the boundary between the living and the dead and needed someone to understand their experience. Robert's photograph served as proof that such encounters were real, while Patricia's maternal wisdom and the children's natural acceptance provided comfort to those struggling to make sense of the impossible. Danny began documenting these stories with his camera, creating a visual record of people whose lives had been touched by the supernatural. Susan, with her gift for seeing into people's hearts, often provided the key insights that helped visitors understand their own experiences. The family discovered that their encounter with the Marlowes had been more than just a chance meeting. It had been a calling, a preparation for a larger purpose. They had been chosen not just to help lost spirits find peace, but to serve as bridges between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. Their ordinary family vacation had transformed them into guardians of extraordinary truths, keepers of stories that needed to be preserved and wisdom that needed to be shared. And sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet, Patricia would swear she could hear children's laughter carried on the wind, and she would smile, knowing that Caroline and Michael were finally playing in a place where childhood lasted forever, and families were never separated by tragedy. The ripples of their encounter at Yosemite continued to spread, touching lives and healing hearts in ways the Henderson family was only beginning to understand. 20 years had passed since that transformative summer at Yosemite, and the Henderson family had built a life around the extraordinary gift they had been given. Their Sacramento home had become known throughout California as a place where people could bring their supernatural experiences without fear of ridicule or disbelief. Danny, now 32 and a professional photographer, had developed a reputation for capturing images that revealed more than the naked eye could see. His coffee table book, Between Worlds: Photographs of the Supernatural, had become a bestseller, though few readers realized that the ghostly figures in his images were actual spirits rather than artistic double exposures. Susan, at 28, had become a counselor specializing in grief and trauma, with an uncanny ability to help people process encounters with deceased loved ones. Her graduate thesis on post-mortem communication and psychological healing had earned her recognition in academic circles as an expert on death-related phenomena. Patricia had started a support group called Bridges of Understanding that met monthly in their home, providing a safe space for families who had experienced the supernatural. Her gentle wisdom and maternal compassion had helped hundreds of people come to terms with experiences that had once seemed impossible to share. Robert, now in his mid-50s, had become something of a legend among park rangers and Forest Service personnel throughout the western United States. His detailed documentation of supernatural encounters in wilderness areas had helped create unofficial protocols for handling such situations with compassion rather than skepticism. On this particular July morning, exactly 20 years after their encounter with the Marlowe family, the Hendersons were preparing for something they had never thought they would do: a return trip to Yosemite. "Are you sure about this?" Patricia asked, as Robert loaded their camping gear into their newer station wagon, a 1980 Ford Country Squire that had replaced their old Chevrolet years earlier. "I think we need to go back," Robert replied, his voice thoughtful. "Not just for ourselves, but to complete the circle somehow." Danny emerged from the house carrying his professional camera equipment, now significantly more sophisticated than the simple Kodak Brownie he had used as a 12-year-old. "The Park Service says that campground has been completely quiet for 2 decades. No unexplained phenomena, no reports of ghostly encounters. It's like the place has been cleansed." Susan joined them, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from their garden. I want to leave these where we first met the Marlowes. It seems like the right thing to do. The drive to Yosemite felt both familiar and strange. The landscape had changed little, but the family had been transformed by 2 decades of serving as bridges between worlds. They approached their destination with a mixture of anticipation and reverence, aware that they were returning not just to a place, but to the source of their life's purpose. The campground looked exactly as Robert remembered it, though the trees had grown taller and the facilities had been modernized. They were assigned to campsite 47, the same site they had occupied 20 years earlier, and across the narrow road was the spot where the Marlowes had parked their impossible motorhome. As they set up their camp, Robert noticed that other families in the campground seemed different from the typical campers they remembered. There was a serenity about the place, a sense of peace that hadn't existed during their first visit. Children played without the restless energy of those sensing unseen watchers, and adults relaxed with the ease of people who felt completely safe. That evening, as they sat around their campfire, Patricia broke the comfortable silence. I can feel them sometimes, you know. Not here, but at home when we're helping other families. It's like the Marlowes are still with us in some way, still helping lost souls find their way. Danny nodded, adjusting his camera settings to capture the firelight. I've seen them in some of my photographs over the years, just glimpses, usually in the background when I'm documenting other supernatural encounters, always looking peaceful, always seeming to approve of what we're doing. They're not the only ones, Susan added softly. All the spirits we helped that day, they've become like guardian angels for other lost souls. Every time we help someone find peace with their own supernatural experience, I think we're continuing the work that started here. Robert looked across the road to the empty campsite, where so much had changed for his family. You know, I've been thinking about something Margaret Whitfield told us years ago. She said that some places hold memories, that traumatic events can leave impressions on the landscape. But this place doesn't feel traumatic anymore, Patricia observed. It feels blessed. Exactly, Robert agreed. I think what happened here 20 years ago transformed this campground from a place of trapped sorrow into something much more positive. The Marlowes and all those other families didn't just find peace for themselves, they blessed this place with their release. As if summoned by their conversation about transformation and blessing, a gentle breeze began to stir through the campground. The air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, but also something else, something that reminded each family member of the moment when the spirits had ascended into the light. Susan stood and walked to the edge of their campsite, holding her bouquet of flowers. I can feel them, she whispered, not trapped or sad like before, but free and grateful. Danny raised his camera instinctively, and through the viewfinder he saw something that made his heart soar. For just a moment, translucent figures appeared among the trees, not the desperate, hungry ghosts they had encountered 20 years earlier, but radiant beings filled with joy and purpose. Caroline Marlowe stepped forward from the group, her child's form glowing with inner light. She waved at Susan and mouthed the words, "Thank you," before placing her ghostly hand over her heart and pointing upward toward the star-filled sky. Thomas, Eleanor, and Michael appeared beside her, their faces serene and grateful. They had come not to ask for help, but to offer their blessings to the family who had shown them the way home. Other spirits materialized around them, all the families who had found peace that extraordinary day 2 decades earlier. They stood in a circle around the Henderson campsite, their forms radiant with contentment, their presence a benediction rather than a threat. "They're saying goodbye," Patricia whispered, tears streaming down her face. Not a sad goodbye, but a grateful one. The spirits began to fade, but as they disappeared, each one placed a hand over their heart and pointed to the Henderson family, a gesture of eternal gratitude and blessing. The last to fade was Caroline, who blew a kiss to Susan before dissolving into sparkles of light that rose toward the stars. The campground fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the quiet of completion, of a story that had finally found its proper ending. Robert looked around at his family, now middle-aged, but still bound together by the extraordinary experience that had shaped their lives. "I think we're done here," he said softly. "Our work at this place is finished." But as they prepared for bed that night, all 4 family members knew that their larger work was far from over. They had been changed by their encounter with the supernatural, transformed from ordinary people into guardians of extraordinary truths. Tomorrow, they would return to Sacramento, to their support groups and counseling sessions, to their photography and documentation, to their life's work of helping others navigate the mysterious boundary between the living and the dead. The photograph Robert had taken 20 years earlier, showing the Henderson family with their ghostly neighbors, remained framed in their home as a reminder of the night that changed everything. But it was no longer the only such image in their collection. Over the years, they had accumulated dozens of photographs documenting supernatural encounters, each one proof that love transcends death and that the bonds between souls survive even the most tragic circumstances. As they settled into their sleeping bags for their final night at Yosemite, Patricia reached for Robert's hand. "Do you ever regret that camping trip? The way it changed our lives so completely?" Robert squeezed her hand gently. "Never. We were given a gift, Patricia. The ability to see beyond the veil, to help souls find peace, to serve as bridges between worlds. How could I regret a calling like that?" Danny and Susan, listening from their own sleeping bags, smiled in the darkness. They too had found purpose in their supernatural abilities, using their gifts to bring comfort and understanding to others who had been touched by the impossible. Above them, the stars shone with unusual brightness, as if the celestial realm itself was acknowledging the work they had done and the peace they had helped restore to this sacred place. The Henderson family slept deeply that night, surrounded by the protective presence of grateful spirits and secure in the knowledge that their encounter with the Marlowe family had not been a random event, but part of a larger plan that had transformed them into instruments of healing and hope. Their camping trip to Yosemite had ended, but their journey as guardians of the supernatural truth would continue for the rest of their lives, a legacy of light that would touch countless souls in the years to come.